Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Friday Harbor Film Festival, and it is my pleasure to moderate the movie Firestorm 77. Incidentally, my name is Terry Lush, for whatever that's worth. But more importantly, we have got Chris Hite, who is the director of Firestorm 77. And with a little luck, we'll shortly have Joseph Valencia with us, who is one of the producers of the production. So hopefully you've all had a chance to watch this movie. And at this time, we are going to start opening it up to questions. I'll go ahead and start, if I may, and I'll address this to Chris since he's the one that I can see on the screen right now. And Chris, what was the motivation that both of you had for actually making this movie? We all had a chance to find out there were some doubters out there, but you might be able to give us a bit more insight into this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry. Glad to be here with everyone. So this film really came about when myself and my co-director, Dennis Ford, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, we got together and were discussing these events. And I really had known nothing about it. And Dennis informed me of his participation in this fire on Vandenberg Air Force Base in 1977. And basically just in a minute told me what he experienced. And I was just absolutely blown away by the scenario. And as we went on to discuss it, we found that many people in the region on the Central Coast had not even heard of this fire. And Dennis often retells the story of bringing this same story up with someone about a decade ago, and the person accusing him of making things up, saying that never happened. And so it was an event that changed the lives of basically the people who participated in it, yet it's not well known. And so that really was the driving force of making this documentary, of not letting those days be forgotten, and especially considering the loss of life that was involved, to really honor the struggle and the sacrifice that happened there.
Okay, so it was certainly to give some clarity that it did happen. You did that very, very well. And obviously, the idea of remembering some of these folks is a good thing to do. We don't have any other questions yet, so I'll ask another one. Can you draw any comparisons between the Honda Canyon fire and the Thomas fire? Because obviously the Thomas fire happened many years later, and I'm sure there were lessons learned, but if you could give us an idea of a comparison between those two, that would be very interesting.
Absolutely. In fact, we address the Thomas fire towards the end of the film as somewhat of an epilogue. And the reality there is that it occurred nearly 40 years after the events that we primarily documented in Firestorm 77. But the fire in 1977 and the Thomas fire in 2017, which at the time was one of the largest fires in California history, and unfortunately has been eclipsed in size. That's a whole other issue as well, the idea of these fires getting larger. But both the Thomas fire, the Vandenberg fire, the Honda Canyon fire, as it's called specifically, occurred in the same county, Santa Barbara County. They were both subject to being propelled and amplified by extreme wind-driven environments. And they both occurred because of mechanical failure, because of power line damage. And so there's a lot of lessons that what we found fascinating is not only we started out to tell the stories of these individuals, but 40 years on, we're learning we're doing the same thing over as a society. We're having the same type of events happen. And so the question became, are we learning? Are we being proactive? Or is the cycle just going to continue?
So one of the purposes of the film, it sounds like you're really getting to it, even with the idea of trying to take these lessons and apply them. For example, do you happen to see any positive results out of either of those two fires toward the Paradise Fire in Northern California?
Right. I mean, there's so many we can add in now throughout the state of California. And it's unfortunately just becoming more of the phrase, the Western United States, is the way we start looking at this because of the abundance of these very cataclysmic, epic, large fires. The fire in 1977 is largely looked at from a fire studies, fire science perspective as being the turning point of these fires turning into these larger ones that are engulfing whole towns, unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of acres. We just had the French fire in California that engulfed 600,000 plus acres. They're getting more immense. The idea of climate change has to come into it. And this fire that we document from 1977 was the turning point, or the beginning point, of when those fires really started to go because of these factors of wind, climate, etc. Things that came out of that moment in 1977, which we document in the film, is the creation of the Vandenberg Hotshots, an organization dedicated completely to fighting fires in that region. And the question, though, goes to a larger point about society, infrastructure, economy. We're having downed power lines, we're having electrical malfunctions that cause these cataclysmic fires. The question is, what do we want as a society? Is the price of cheap and easy electricity at the flip of a switch worth what we're paying on the other side when these fires break out? Do we have to make sacrifices? So we don't pretend to answer those questions in the film, but we do address them, and we like to lay them out there for us, anyone who watches it, to really have as a takeaway. And from there, it becomes the responsibility of all of us to discuss where are we going to go as a society in the face of these fires growing larger every single year.
Okay, it's interesting as you give us more of your thinking on this. There is a bigger message than the film had. The film, in my opinion, did a wonderful job of documenting what happened. And of course, you were able to draw on a lot of history from the news feeds, newspapers, all of those types of things. But there is a lot more as far as the message, and it might go further than you even care to. We haven't had any other questions come in yet. So happily, I enjoyed the movie, and I'm going to keep asking a few other questions.
Please do.
And encourage you to expand in whatever direction you would either like or think you can get away with. But so we've talked about the two fires about 40 years apart, the Paradise Fire. And how do I put this? Have we learned enough out of this? We haven't seen it applied, obviously, the way some of us might hope, but.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the reality. And so the film does address multiple facets. It does talk about, again, the kind of way our infrastructure and our society is positioned, that these fires can come from the things we rely on, electrical sources. But we also wanted to touch on, in terms of looking at the film from, again, a fire science or fire studies, fire history perspective. These types of films tend to look at when the fire occurred, how it got put out. We also wanted to look at not just that collective response, but the individuals within. And then what happens after that moment? Okay, the fire is out. But obviously, as you saw in the film, the people paid a heavy price psychologically for what they went through. And so that's another facet we have to ask ourselves. If we're willing to live in a society where these fires can occur because of our infrastructure, are we not going to support the people who are then charged with going out to fight these fires? Is there going to be a back end where we're going to support them with the psychological help that they need, the support, the emotional support? And this film comes out of a time period, 1970s, when obviously there was kind of an unwritten code. You start to look at the idea of male identity, the idea of you don't talk about your problems or how you felt or the emotions on any type of event. And so society kind of kept these types of events under wraps for decades. And we're now starting to realize that wasn't healthy, to have people go through these traumatic events and carry these events with them for decades in their personal lives. All types of negatives came out of that. There is certainly the idea of honoring people who fight these fires, but I think the film also asks that question, is it enough just to honor them, to put up a plaque or a statue and say, thank you? Is there more that needs to be done on the back end to support the people that go through what we now consider PTSD?
Okay, and it looks like we have a question here.
Yeah.
This would be an excellent follow-up question after 40 some odd years. Has there been an effort to bury power lines statewide?
We don't really address that in the film, but I'm personally aware of the debates living in California amongst that. And the number one barrier to that, of course, is cost. Anytime that issue has been raised, we've been given figures that come back at $250,000 per mile to address that, to make that type of change. So it again comes back to the idea of will. Is this something we want to do, or is this something that we're going? It's right now. It's just a political football match, is what it is, and politicians will eventually move that ball back or forward, despite the wishes of the general populace. But it's something that most likely needs to happen. You look at European countries; they've been doing that type of electrical grid system for years. Because they've experienced this as well, and they took it upon themselves to address that in a very proactive fashion. We always have a political debate over matters of life or death, and you can extrapolate that to any facet of American life, not just fires, automobile safety, gun safety, etc. Everything becomes politicized, and so this issue is absolutely no different. It's something that I think everyone's in agreement could ameliorate a huge problem, but the political will to do it is a completely different issue.
Okay, thank you. While we're waiting for another question to come in, there was a section in the movie that I found interesting, and that was the jurisdictional disputes between whether it's the county versus city fire departments versus the commander at Vandenberg. I have a hunch from what I've heard that jurisdictional disputes, including even different radio frequencies and the whole thing, are still a problem. Have you seen any progress in that?
From everyone we talked to, because we did consult with a number of people who are still with the military, the Air Force specifically, people who are actively involved in the Vandenberg hotshots currently, they're all in agreement that great progress has been made in that regard. The thing that we have to remember is, again, 1977, the atmosphere in the country, it was still a Cold War climate. We had just basically pulled out of Vietnam 2 years earlier. There was a lot of unease in the country regarding military matters. There were a lot of people at Vandenberg who had just returned from Vietnam, who were in positions of high command. And as you actually even hear in the film, it was verbalized that this fire was just treated as an enemy that could be stopped, that we can get out in front and that we can destroy it, as if it was just taking out another army. Fire doesn't respond like armies, or doesn't think like a military regime. Fire goes where fire wants to go. And the people who understood fire the best were somewhat marginalized, which allowed the fire to do what it does best: to grow, to spread, to overcome, to conquer. And so there was definitely a breakdown of the chain of command. There was definitely the idea of egos involved. I think it's fair to say that since that time, a lot of that has changed, just because of the conditions in the country. We're no longer in that kind of Cold War crisis mentality where everything was top secret and everyone was viewed as suspect who was going to be near top secret installations. But that drove a lot of it. But we're happy to report that most people we've talked to who were consultants on the film seem to think that's really changed for the positive.
Okay, another question, and that is that in the 2019, I believe, meeting in Vandenberg, the hot shots were basically introduced. What year or decade did hot shots actually become a part of the firefighting effort in Vandenberg?
Right. Well, they started to evolve that right after this 1977 fire. So they've been out there now for a great many decades. At the time, though, and you hear it verbalized in the documentary, the people who were part of what was considered the Vandenberg Fire Service did not feel that they were adequately trained, did not feel that they had the adequate equipment to fight a wildfire. They were largely trained to deal with structural fires on the base. You know, this is a facility that launches to this day rockets, satellites. So that's where the response was largely looked at. But a wildfire that starts out in the middle of the base and basically a no man's land and then spreads to several miles wide, that was not part of the training regimen at the time. It wasn't viewed as something that could happen. You get a sense from the participants in the documentary that they weren't even expecting that something like this could happen, because it was so late in the year. It's in the winter season. Other parts of the country are obviously experiencing snowfall at that time. Santa Barbara County does not receive snowfall on the ground like that, but they were expecting rain. And so for this fire to happen and the rain to hold off as long as it did really caught everyone unaware. So it was just the perfect storm of conditions that no one was expecting. A windstorm that seemed to emerge out of nowhere, a prolonged period of drought at a time when most people were thinking fire season was behind them.
I have one other question here that I obviously had thought a few things as I was watching the movie. What message would you like to give? And it could be as many different messages as you like to the audiences that have already watched the movie, as far as where you think we should have gone, where we are going, but something that's an add-on, a prologue, I guess.
Right.
Do you have anything you'd like to say?
Again, just not treating, we tend to think of firefighting, and again, you can port it out to a lot of different disciplines, whether it's military, police, etc. We tend to think of it as something that's taken care of by people who have the training, they do it, and then they go home, and we don't want to have to interact with it. Fire is now reaching the point in the United States where it's going to become something that people can expect to see in certain parts of the country right on their doorstep. And so the idea of awareness, not thinking of this as something that happens to other people. And along with that, thinking of the people who are actually charged with going out to fight these fires. And again, the big call that we had, I think, out of this, based on the participants from 1977, one of them says it in the film, it's happened 40 years ago, and we're talking about it like it just happened yesterday. These events never leave these people. There's trauma involved, there's psychological effects. And so what we want to leave people with is to think of it as more than just extinguishing a conflagration. Think of the people who are involved. If there's death and mortality involved, it affects everyone that's on the fire, and they carry that with them through all their subsequent years in the career. So thinking of those people, we as a society thinking about what are we going to put in place to help them with in a post-fire environment, which were conditions that just weren't there in 1977. The participants in this film were largely told, it's over, get back to work. And so learning from those mistakes, not repeating that same pattern of move on and forget, I think will be of great benefit to everyone involved in fire service.
Okay, well, as a moderator, I think I'm supposed to ask questions and be referee, but I can't help but offer an opinion while we've got some of this time, and as gently as I can. I would think, given I dare say the word climate change, but if I were to say it, is there some room for more people to watch this particular documentary or movie and maybe actually believe it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's part of that dialogue. Again, when we started this, it really was conceived of the idea of Dennis, who was the co-director, and Joe, who I wish could have joined us today. Obviously, he's having technical problems. Would have loved to have his perspective, because Joe Valencia, who was one of the producers on this film, was actually on those events in 1977, as was Dennis. And so I was not. I lived on the other side of the country in 1977. We often joke about how I was pulling a sled up a snow-covered hillside while they were out fighting a fire in December. But their firsthand perspective is incredible of what they went through, especially Dennis, he was an Air Force service airman with no firefighter training, and was basically given a shovel and told, attack that 40-foot wall, 40-foot high wall of flame over there. And so the idea, though, getting back to your question, Terry, yeah, I don't think we can look at climate change as not a factor. Again, that's why this film, the fire documented in this film, is really seen as instrumental in terms of fire history. It's seen as the fire where all of these elements converge, that there's something different about the landscape now. There's something was different about the climate that year, the year preceding it, that really allowed this fire to be something more than it needed to be. It started as a brush fire, could have been easily taken care of, but when you put in a water-starved landscape, hurricane force winds that were up to 100 miles per hour that no one was expecting or had ever really experienced in this part of the country. Those have now become common characteristics of the Central Coast and much of the Western United States. Dry land, water-starved land, high force winds. There's no denying that that has come on in the last several decades and is a factor in these films. And so it's really a fool's perspective to think that the changing climate is not going to continue to enhance these fire events as they occur. The other part of the argument is just forest management, of which you get into really nuanced debates. That's not the full answer. You know, when we see fires like the one in Paradise again, yeah, that was more of a topography that was surrounded by forest, a community that was built into a wooded area. The debate about forest management arises. What should we do with the forests? Should we be using fire ourselves on a more regular basis to clear out those forests? That's ongoing. The idea, though, that the fire that starts in one location isn't going to spread when you have 60 and above mile per hour winds behind it, though, is something that just can't even be debated. It's going to pick it up and it's going to distribute it over several miles of land. So we have to consider that. We have to consider climate.
Well, Chris, just a slightly different twist on all of this. You obviously did a very nice job directing this movie. What other projects do you have that you're working on right now? I don't know really much about your background, but you must do this kind of thing for more than just a hobby.
I've been making films for about 2 decades now. I teach film here on the Central Coast at Allen Hancock College. I worked professionally as an editor and cinematographer on the East Coast for about a decade as well. Most of my films, this is the first film I've done that's set on the West Coast. Most of my other work is regionally based on the East Coast. And this one, again, we always talk about how this project came together amongst ourselves. Really was serendipity that I would meet Dennis and he would expose me to this story. And then shortly after, Dennis contacts me and says, I met this guy, Joe, who wrote a book about these events. And the next thing we know, we were meeting and we had 12 participants on that fire who wanted to be interviewed because for 40 years, no one ever asked them, hey, what happened back in 1977? And then we took these men who worked in fire service their whole careers, were facing life and death issues, probably as hardened of individuals as you can find, put a microphone and a camera on them, and suddenly they're broke down in an emotional state, remembering events from 40 years prior. So it's been an amazing journey. For me personally, just learning about these events and documenting them has been an absolutely educational, eye-opening experience for myself. And it's caused me to now, as a resident of California, to not look at fire as I did previously. I always thought that happens elsewhere. That doesn't happen here. I'm starting to realize now it's a potential of everyday life.
Well, I think we've just about covered everything from our side, and we want to make sure you had a chance to enlighten us from your point of view. We probably can call it good at this point, and all of us get back to whatever it is we're supposed to be doing on a Sunday afternoon. But thank you very much. This was an enjoyable movie and a very nice chance to meet you personally.
Thank you. Glad to be here at Friday Harbor. Wish we could have all been in person, but this is as fantastic of a job as a film festival can do. And so everyone watching is very lucky to have this event to attend. So even via distance, it's great for us to be together. And thank you to everyone who watched the film. And thank you, Terry, for all these great questions. Thank you to the whole team.